Hello and welcome to this podcast hosted by Asia Pacific Economics on the topic of the Trump tariffs. My name is David Austin, Managing Director of Austin Media, and I will be discussing the latest shockwaves impacting U.S. tariff policy and their global impact with Rajiv Biswas, CEO of Asia Pacific Economics. Rajiv, today we are reacting to the U.S. Supreme Court ruling to strike down some of the core Trump tariff measures that were introduced in 2025. This dramatic decision creates risks of renewed turmoil for the world trading system. So I'd like to know, what is your assessment of the economic impact of this decision on the U.S. economy?
Thanks, David. We've already had a very tumultuous year in 2025 with the Trump tariffs being imposed on many countries around the world and considerable changes in those tariffs as well, which created a lot of disruption in world trade. And many countries were very much engaged with the U.S. to try to find some sort of deals that they could agree and stabilize the situation. And that's sort of where we were at the end of last year, with many countries around the world having come to some sort of bilateral trade deals with the U.S. And I think that process has been continuing in early 2026. But now this new shockwave from the U.S. Supreme Court ruling has struck down some of the core tariff measures that the Trump administration, particularly the reciprocal tariff measures that they'd impose on other countries. And the Supreme Court ruling has made those particular tariff measures illegal. What that means is that for many countries, there's considerable disruption now as to what exactly are the deals that they've agreed. Are those still valid? Or if they're not valid, then what are the implications going forward? And for the US economy, of course, a big concern for both consumers and for businesses had been the impact of these quite severe effective tariff rate hikes on inflation and input costs. So for many businesses in the US, they had to pay these much higher tariffs. And that, of course, often was passed through in higher costs to the consumer. And now the big issue is revenues that were levied under what's called the IEEPA rules. Since they're illegal, are they now refundable? And the assessment seems to be that since the Supreme Court has struck down those particular tariffs, that the implication would be that U.S. businesses would be eligible to claim those. So that was not explicit in the Supreme Court ruling. So what that means is that you have a whole new process in the legal system, which could be quite protracted for companies to try to claim back all of those tariffs that were paid that have been struck down. Now, I should highlight that not all tariff measures have been struck down under the Supreme Court ruling. Many of the tariff measures that were imposed by the Trump administration were under different sections of tariff measures. For example, industry-specific tariff measures under Section 232, and also trade discriminatory tariff measures under Section 301. These measures still remain in place. So not all tariffs will be refundable, but a significant part will. And some estimates are that as much as 170 billion US dollars of the tariffs that were paid last year would eventually be able to be refunded to businesses. So that's a big transfer back from the US government to US businesses eventually. And so that eventually may be quite a positive factor for the bottom line of some US companies. However, I think when we look at the overall impact on the US economy, President Trump has immediately announced that there will be new tariffs to replace the tariffs that were struck down, and there will be a new global tariff of 15% under Section 122 of the US Trade Act of 1974. So that entitles, apparently, the government to place a 15% tariff measure. And that would largely replace the lost revenue going forward. It cannot replace the revenue from last year, but as far as the Trump administration is concerned, it will allow replacement of the revenues from tariffs going forward. However, the duration of this new rule is only for 150 days. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen after those 150 days. And even the legitimacy of that new approach is already being questioned by some. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen going forward in terms of the net impact on the US economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And as you said, the Trump administration has been using these tariffs as a key geopolitical policy lever to negotiate these bilateral trade deals with nations worldwide. So what does the Supreme Court decision mean for the U.S. trade deals agreed upon with so many of these key trade partners? And could some of these deals collapse?
Well, I think the implication of the Supreme Court ruling is that that component of the trade deals that have been agreed bilaterally between the US and many other countries that incorporates the IEEPA tariffs, which most of them are a very significant part of the overall trade deals that were agreed, that part would need to be agreed because that segment has now been ruled illegal. So what it means is that these new tariff measures that have been announced by the Trump administration would need to be renegotiated with the various countries. Obviously, the previous measures will have to be taken out of the text. As I've already mentioned, there are other tariffs that are part of these trade deals for many countries under Section 232 and also Section 301. So those would stay in place. And other components of the trade deals would also stay in place. And what's important for many countries is carve-outs that they've agreed with the US in some very important areas for particular countries. From the point of view of the countries that have negotiated deals with the US, they'll probably be keen in most cases to find some kind of continuity rather than wanting to throw everything up in the air again and start all over again with their negotiations. They may actually prefer to find a compromise that will allow the US to introduce that new 15% tariff into the agreements and keep everything else pretty much the same, because those are hard negotiated outcomes. And some of those carve-outs that countries manage to achieve with the US, they don't want to give those up lightly because those are important trade concessions that were agreed. However, I think what we are going to see is a lot of scrutiny by countries around the world of the deals that were already done. And it does seem like there'll be another reopening of negotiation processes, having just concluded many of these deals. It's back, not exactly back to square one, but again, a new process of negotiations, which is creating uncertainty and concerns amongst many governments around the world.
As they go to scrutinize these agreements, they're doing it through the lens that this cudgel that Trump once had is no longer with him, right? Is that going to change the dynamics a bit on some of these negotiations?
I think it can do, particularly where the relationship between the US and the counterparty countries was very difficult. Then obviously this opens the door for, again, questioning the whole agreement. And there was a lot of friction between some countries and the US over the quite severe tariff measures that were imposed on them. But I think a lot of that seemed to be negotiated, into some sort of more moderate agreement. So some of the most severe tariff measures under the reciprocal tariffs that were initially announced by the Trump administration were negotiated down considerably for many countries. If we look around the Asia Pacific, many countries ended up with much lower tariff rates than were initially signaled by the US. So
Mhm.
for many of those countries, they may not see much advantage in throwing away everything and trying to start all over again
Mhm.
with an administration that's clearly very committed to continuing to use tariff measures. And the US administration has already said that they will be putting much more emphasis on industry focused tariff
Mhm.
measures, which had already been put in place for some sectors of industry, such as steel and aluminium, and also a number of other important industries. But explain that they do intend to refocus on perhaps adding more of those. That's not always straightforward because it's subject to national security clauses. So it can't be applied to every industry, but it can be applied in cases where they can show just cause related to national security grounds.
Mhm.
And then the Section 301 tariffs can also be used in a more uh, stricter way, I guess, with many countries. And that's based on trade imbalances and unfair trade practices. So again, there's a lot of leeway for the US administration to use other tariff measures to replace those that have been struck down by the
Mhm.
Supreme Court. So I don't think we're going to see the US administration shifting away from using tariffs as a key part of their economic policy. And on that basis, probably most countries will want to find a compromise, knowing that they could potentially be subject to other tariff measures from the US administration if they don't try to work together with the administration
Mhm.
to kind of find continuity and,
Mhm.
uh, and find different wording for the deals that have already been negotiated.
Mhm. Well, that makes me want to ask you to jump right ahead to the US-China trade negotiations, which are still ongoing. How do you think this is going to affect them from this point forward?
Well, I think again, they are subject to some of those tariffs that have now been struck down with the Supreme Court, but China was also subject to other trade measures. So I think China is a good example where they will probably be looking to find some sort of compromise deal. And they themselves do have some important negotiating levers, such as rare earths, which they've used very effectively. So I think there will be a new negotiation in the light of this Supreme Court decision. But I think both sides will be looking to find some sort of compromise deal. And of course, President Trump is due to visit China at the end of March. So that will probably be the next opportunity to have another round of detailed negotiations and at least try to find another temporary compromise solution that will have some duration, even though that clearly won't be the final deal. I think
Mhm.
the US China trade negotiations are going to be very complex. And I think there was no expectation that there would just be a very easy final settlement. Probably what we'll see is that at the end of March and early April, when President Trump visits China, that will be the opportunity to find a new temporary compromise that will allow trade to continue, um, perhaps till the end of this year and perhaps somewhat beyond that, while they try to work out a more durable, longer lasting solution. But
Mhm.
having said all that, I do think that there will be ongoing frictions over the medium term between the US and China in many areas, particularly areas of strategic competition, such as defense technology, advanced semiconductors. I think already we've seen a lot of friction between the US and China in those areas. So I think those areas will continue to be areas of strategic competition with continued use of tariff measures, sanctions by both sides. Uh, but I think the broader uh, share of their overall trade is not that contentious because probably the large majority of bilateral trade in areas such as energy or agriculture or basic manufacturing, these are areas where both US companies and Chinese companies want continuity. It's in the interests of both countries. So I would say that for 80% of bilateral trade, there's probably a strong desire by both the US and China to find a good compromise solution that allows trade to continue. But we are going to see strategic competition in some of those areas where there is concern, and notably defense technology, advanced semiconductors, and some other areas of high technology are likely to be ongoing areas of strategic competition.
And it definitely will be interesting to see the upcoming meeting when Trump travels to Beijing, I believe, to meet President Xi Jinping. So we'll be looking out for that. That should be a really uh, entertaining meeting, I think, for all of us watchers. Let me move around to some of the other large nations in the Asia Pacific that have recently concluded their trade deals with the US. India being one, they reached a critical bilateral trade deal with the US just a few weeks ago. And then the Indonesian delegation signed a bilateral trade deal with the US just before the US Supreme Court issued its decision. So, what does it mean for those key trade deals?
I think the India trade deal that was reached a few weeks ago was seen as a great compromise between India and the US because it was a very problematic situation for India because it was facing tariff measures from the US that were already at 50%. And there were threats of even more tariff measures that could have affected India. But a deal was done, and the Indian rate of tariff was reduced down to 18% in terms of what the US would be charging Indian goods imported into the US. So it was seen as quite a beneficial outcome for the Indian economy and for Indian exporters, given the US is a key market for India and exports of both goods and also services. So I think that was seen as a very good outcome. But of course, now with the Supreme Court ruling, what it means is that the core of that agreement in terms of the tariff measures that were applied will now have to be revisited. And indeed, the Indian side have postponed a planned visit to continue the detailed negotiations on that trade deal until they can understand better what the implications of the Supreme Court ruling are, and until obviously the US side has clarified how they intend to go forward. But I think from the Indian point of view, because that deal provided quite a good outcome compared to their previous situation, they will be keen to find a compromise solution, whether that means that they will accept those 15% tariff rates under Section 122. That could be, from India's point of view, a reasonable outcome for them because they would actually be paying slightly lower tariffs to the US than under the initial deal. But I think what we're going to see is somewhat of a delay while both sides try to figure out how to get that deal reworded and make it durable. And of course, even with those new tariff rates, if their lifespan is only 150 days, that again creates uncertainty about what happens after that 150 days expires, because under the law, it would require congressional approval to extend it beyond 150 days. And there may be significant opposition within Congress to making that kind of extension. It's a similar situation for Indonesia. It's perhaps even more unfortunate that they're actually in the US in Washington, D.C. on the very day that the Supreme Court ruling came out, and they just agreed a bilateral deal with the US. Again, that deal is much more favorable than the initial reciprocal tariff rates that were applied to Indonesia. So they saw it as a favorable outcome compared to the original situation. And they also got very important carve-outs for some key exports, which would then not be subject to US tariffs. So I think they're keen to get that deal back into place and preserve those carve-outs for some of their key exports to the US. Indonesia had also agreed some other important carve-outs for some agricultural commodities that were important. So I think they're keen to try to preserve the fundamental carve-outs that are already negotiated. And I'm pretty sure the US will want to do that as well. So again, I think it's probably a question of some delay while both sides revisit how this can be done. But I expect that the US will probably be keen to extend a similar sort of compromise deal to Indonesia, similar to the deal that already signed, so that there's continuity and that the US intention is not to create too much disruption to what's already been agreed. And I think the same would apply for many other countries in the Asia Pacific where bilateral deals have already been done between the US and, for example, with South Korea, with Japan, and other ASEAN countries as well.
Well, I'd like to shift to politics a little bit since the U.S. midterm elections are rapidly approaching. Do you think this Supreme Court decision is a setback for the Republican Party, seeing as it was sort of the centerpiece of its international trade policy agenda, and now it's been ruled illegal?
I think if we step back a bit and look at what's happening in the polls ahead of the midterms, which are coming up towards the end of this year, there has been considerable concern in the Republican Party that support in favor of the Democrats has been rising. And so I think that has created a lot of concerns that potentially the Republicans could lose their majority in the House and perhaps even in the Senate, which would then obviously be very damaging for their legislative process in the second half of the Trump administration. And it could potentially become a lame duck administration. And President Trump himself has, warned of the potential risks if the Republicans lose control in Congress. So clearly, it's a increasing focus for both parties as we gradually head towards those midterms. And I think two of the key areas that have given increasing support to the Democrats is, first of all, on the economy, which is fundamental for any election. But the polls are suggesting that there are rising concerns amongst the U.S. electorate, certainly in some parts of the U.S., about the economic policies of the Trump administration. And, I think tariffs have been a divisive area. For some, they've been very supportive of tariffs and the objective that the U.S. administration has had to try to get manufacturing jobs in particular back to the U.S., what's called reshoring. On the other hand, it's also pushed up prices. So many businesses have been upset by these tariff measures, pushing up their prices, forcing them to pass on higher costs to consumers. And of course, consumers have had to pay for these higher costs. The average tariff rate in 2025 spiked up very sharply to over 11% in terms of the average effective tariff rate. And that's the highest since 1943. So you can see the impact has been significant on different segments of the electorate. So I think that's certainly an issue of concern. And in particular, if the Supreme Court is now, as it has done, ruled that they're actually illegal, at least some of those tariff measures, it also, I think, undermines somewhat the credibility of some of the centerpieces of Trump economic policy. So I think it is probably something of a setback as we head towards the midterms. But there's also been a backlash, I think, against some of the harsh implementation of immigration policy. While I think in many parts of the US there have been support for the broad concept that, of making the borders more secure, the way it's been implemented in some states has raised concern among some segments of the community.
Hmm.
Obviously, we've seen quite a backlash in Minnesota, but I
Hmm.
think in important states for the midterms where there's a lot of seats at stake, such as Texas,
Hmm.
there's also, I think, been evidence of growing concerns amongst the very important Hispanic electorate about how some of these immigration policies are being enforced.
Hmm.
So I think all of these things are making the midterms now very much front and center in terms of the US political landscape and also for the future policies of the Trump administration.
Absolutely. Rajiv, thank you so much for sharing your insights on these twists and turns that have happened in the U.S. Tariff policy under U.S. President Trump. In conclusion, I'd just like to ask you, what is your assessment of the outlook for U.S. trade policy for the coming year of 2026? Given the latest new tariff measures announced by Trump have a limitation duration of 150 days.
Well, I do think we're again back in a period of considerable uncertainty for world trade. And while I think many of the trade deals that have already been agreed will probably continue in some form because both sides will be trying to find a compromise solution to allow continuity, the uncertainty over the duration of these new tariffs is an important source of concern because if they expire after 150 days, what does that then mean for these deals? And will it mean that the US administration will come up with different kinds of tariffs, potentially on different sectors, that are again very disruptive for world trade and for bilateral trade between the US and many other countries? From the perspective of many countries, for example, in the Asia Pacific region, where the US has traditionally been a very important export market, I think this will just reinforce efforts to diversify trade and reduce reliance on the US as such a key export market and try to diversify supply chains, diversify markets towards other fast growing economies. And of course, in the Asia Pacific region in particular, there are many opportunities with fast growing economies in the Asia Pacific region. Where actually some of the fastest growing countries in the world are in the Asia Pacific. So I think
Hmm.
many governments will probably be putting big efforts in their trade policy focus, trying to build stronger trade relations with other partners in the Asia Pacific, with the fast growing countries in the Middle East, the Gulf states such as UAE or Saudi. And in the Asia Pacific in particular, I think ASEAN has been a very fast growing economy. India has been the fastest growing country in the G20 for the past 3 years. So I think there'll be a lot more efforts now on a medium to longer term basis to try to refocus trade policy towards developing stronger exports to those fast growing markets that are perhaps much more stable in terms
Hmm.
of their policy settings on trade.
So really, if I hear you, it's if I boil it down for the upcoming year, it's uncertainty and then diversifying supply chains and reducing reliance on any single market, especially the U.S. market in this era of uncertainty. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're what we've already seen in 2025 with considerable uncertainty in world trade caused by US tariff policies. It looks
Hmm.
like 2026 is going to be somewhat of a repeat of the same,
Hmm.
countries again having to reposition their trade relations both with the US and with other key trade partners worldwide.
Well, thank you so much, Rajiv. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. And let me thank everyone watching. Thank you for joining our podcast with Rajiv Biswas, CEO of Asia Pacific Economics, on U.S. tariff policy and its impact on the Asia Pacific region. If you found this discussion valuable, please like and subscribe to the channel for more. Thank you.